Later reign, 1297 to 1307, constitutional crisis. During the late 13th century, King Edward I of England encountered mounting financial difficulties due to his unceasing military campaigns. These conflicts placed an enormous economic burden on his subjects, who struggled under the weight of escalating taxes. Before 1294, Edward had imposed only 3 lay subsidies, but between 1294 and 1297, he introduced 4 additional taxes, generating a sum exceeding £200,000. In addition to direct taxation, Edward's government relied on prizes, the compulsory seizure of commodities like wool and hides. Among the most detested levies was an additional duty on wool, infamously known as the moltolt, or unjustly taken, which further inflamed popular resentment. The king's relentless financial demands gradually provoked a strong wave of political resistance, setting the stage for one of the most turbulent periods of his reign. Clerical resistance and the papal bulls. Initially, opposition to Edward's fiscal policies emerged not from the lay population, but from the clergy. In 1294, Edward demanded that the church contribute half of its revenues to the crown. This unprecedented requisition met resistance, yet Edward swiftly responded by threatening rebellious clergy with outlawry. Faced with little alternative, they ultimately conceded to his demands. At this juncture, Robert Winchelsea, who had been appointed Archbishop of Canterbury, was in Italy awaiting papal consecration. Upon returning to England in January 1295, he found himself compelled to approve another significant grant to the king later that year. However, the situation changed dramatically in 1296 when Pope Boniface VIII issued the papal bull Clericis Laicos, a decree forbidding clergy from paying taxes to secular rulers without papal authorization. English clergymen, invoking this directive, refused Edward's demands. The king retaliated by declaring them outlaws, stripping them of royal protection. This placed Winchelsea in an acute dilemma. He had to choose between loyalty to the Pope or submission to the English crown. He opted for a compromise, allowing each clergyman to decide individually whether to comply. The crisis was alleviated toward the end of 1296 when Boniface issued a new bull, Et si de statu, which permitted clerical taxation in cases of urgent necessity. This granted Edward a means to continue extracting revenue from the clergy despite earlier opposition. The growing resistance of the nobility. Opposition from the lay nobility took longer to materialize, but when it did, it proved equally formidable. The most contentious issue centered on Edward's authority to summon military service and his unilateral taxation practices. In February 1297, at the Salisbury Parliament, Roger Bigod, the 5th Earl of Norfolk, boldly challenged the king's demand for military service. He insisted that his obligations extended only to fighting alongside the king, and he refused to accept orders to serve abroad in Edward's absence. Specifically, he contended that if Edward intended to lead a campaign in Flanders, he could not simultaneously command his subjects to fight in Gascony. By mid-1297, Bigod had allied with Humphrey de Bohun, the 3rd Earl of Hereford and Constable of England. Together, they composed a formal list of grievances known as the Remonstrances, voicing their strong opposition to the king's excessive taxation and military conscription policies. Their resistance emboldened others, leading to a broader noble opposition to Edward's increasingly autocratic rule. Confrontation and compromise. Undeterred, Edward pressed forward with his fiscal demands, requesting yet another lay subsidy. However, this time he bypassed the full parliament and sought approval from only a select group of nobles. This exclusive decision-making process incensed the broader nobility and further fueled the growing unrest. While Edward focused on preparing for his military campaign in Flanders, Bigod and de Bohun took decisive action by confronting officials at the Exchequer, effectively halting the collection of the new tax. At this point, England stood on the brink of internal conflict. With Edward abroad and his military forces significantly depleted, tensions escalated to the verge of civil war. However, an external crisis intervened. In September 1297, the Scots dealt a severe blow to the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Faced with a renewed Scottish threat, Edward and his nobles found common cause. To mend relations and secure support for his impending Scottish campaign, Edward issued the Confirmatio Cartarum, a significant reaffirmation of both the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest. This decree formally acknowledged the principle that taxation required broad consent, thereby placating many of his discontented barons. Continued political struggles. Despite the fragile peace achieved in 1297, Edward's difficulties with his barons and clergy persisted into the early 14th century. Repeatedly, he was called upon to honor the commitments he had made in the Confirmatio Cartarum. Of particular concern was his promise to uphold the Charter of the Forest, a document designed to limit royal encroachment on vast tracts of common land. In 1301, Parliament pressured Edward to conduct a comprehensive review of the royal forests, compelling the king to make further concessions. However, in 1305, he successfully obtained a papal bull that released him from these promises, once again demonstrating his reluctance to relinquish control over key resources. The decline of opposition. Ultimately, it was not concessions but a shift in key political figures that weakened resistance to Edward's rule. The movement against him lost momentum following the deaths of influential figures. Humphrey de Bohun passed away in 1298 after returning from Scotland, removing one of the primary leaders of the noble opposition. In 1302, Roger Bigard reached a personal accord with Edward, securing his financial future by agreeing to make the king his heir in exchange for an annual grant. This effectively neutralized his opposition. With these figures pacified or gone, resistance to Edward's fiscal and military policies significantly diminished. Edward also exacted retribution on Archbishop Winchelsea, who had remained steadfast in opposing clerical taxation. When Clement V was elected pope in 1305, he proved more amenable to Edward's influence. Under Edward's urging, Clement suspended Winchelsea from office, eliminating one of the strongest voices against royal taxation of the Church. Edward's legacy, governance, and constitutional change. As Edward's reign drew to a close, he had largely succeeded in consolidating his authority, albeit at significant political and social costs. His relentless pursuit of taxation and his demands for military service had deeply strained relations between the monarchy and both the clergy and the nobility. Though he managed to secure short-term compliance through calculated concessions and strategic political maneuvering, the grievances of his opponents remained unresolved. The conflicts that defined his later reign foreshadowed the continuing struggle between the English monarchy and Parliament over taxation and governance. Edward's financial policies and his resistance to noble and clerical opposition laid the groundwork for constitutional changes in England. His methods of revenue extraction, his suppression of dissent, and his political compromises all contributed to an evolving legal framework that gradually defined the rights of both monarchs and subjects. Though Edward successfully reasserted royal authority, his reign left behind a legacy of unresolved tensions that would resurface in subsequent generations. His efforts to finance his military ambitions and enforce his authority set a precedent for future English rulers. By the time of his death in 1307, England had experienced a decade of constitutional crises that helped shape the nation's political landscape for centuries to come. Return to Scotland, resistance, conquest, and rebellion. The unfinished conquest and early resistance. Edward I of England believed that his conquest of Scotland was complete when he left the country in 1296, following his overwhelming victory over John Balliol and the submission of the Scottish nobility. However, this assumption proved to be premature, as discontent and defiance quickly began to resurface across Scotland. Andrew de Murray in the north and William Wallace in the south spearheaded a growing resistance movement, rallying forces against the English occupation. These leaders were determined to reclaim Scottish independence, and their efforts led to one of the most famous confrontations in medieval Scottish history. On September 11, 1297, the Scottish forces, led by Wallace and Murray, achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Despite being outnumbered, the Scots utilized superior tactics and knowledge of the terrain to decimate the English army commanded by John de Warenne, the 6th Earl of Surrey, and Hugh de Cressingham. The bridge itself became a bottleneck, preventing the English forces from effectively deploying their superior numbers, leading to a crushing defeat. The loss sent shockwaves throughout England, forcing Edward to take immediate action. Edward's retaliation and the Battle of Falkirk. Determined to restore English dominance, Edward returned from his military campaigns in Flanders and marched north to retaliate. On July 22, 1298, he faced Wallace's forces at the Battle of Falkirk. Unlike Stirling Bridge, this engagement saw the English emerge victorious. Edward's army, composed of heavily armed cavalry and skilled longbowmen, overwhelmed the Scottish formations. Wallace's schiltrons, tightly packed defensive units of spearmen, proved ineffective against the relentless English archers. The Scots suffered heavy losses, and Wallace was forced into hiding, resigning as Guardian of Scotland soon after. Despite this significant victory, Edward failed to secure complete control over Scotland. By 1299, Scottish forces had regrouped, and under new leadership, they successfully recaptured Stirling Castle, demonstrating that resistance remained resilient. Edward continued to campaign in Scotland over the next few years, capturing strategically vital locations, including Cullaverach Castle in 1300. However, the Scots avoided direct confrontations, instead opting for guerrilla-style warfare, conducting raids and striking at English supply lines. Diplomatic maneuvers and the fall of Wallace. Recognizing the need for external support, the Scots turned to the Pope for intervention. In 1301, Pope Boniface VIII issued a papal bull urging Edward to recognize Scottish sovereignty. This request was rejected by the English crown, as reflected in the Baron's Letter of 1301, which asserted England's rights over Scotland. By 1303, the geopolitical landscape shifted when England secured a peace agreement with France, effectively isolating Scotland diplomatically. With this advantage, Edward launched another campaign, systematically subjugating Scottish strongholds. In 1304, many of the Scottish nobles, including Robert the Bruce, pledged their allegiance to Edward. The final blow to the Wallace-led resistance came in 1305 when he was betrayed by a fellow Scot, Sir John de Menteith. Captured and transported to London, Wallace was charged with treason and subjected to a brutal execution. His public death was meant as a warning to other rebels, but instead, it cemented his status as a national martyr. The rise of Robert the Bruce and renewed rebellion. Although Wallace's execution seemed to mark the end of organized resistance, the struggle for Scottish independence was far from over. In a dramatic turn of events, Robert the Bruce, who had previously sworn loyalty to Edward, shifted his allegiance and took a bold step toward reclaiming Scotland. On February 10, 1306, he murdered his rival, John Comyn, at a church in Dumfries, eliminating a major obstacle to his ambitions. A few weeks later, on March 25, 1306, he was crowned King of Scotland, openly challenging English authority. Bruce's actions triggered an immediate response from Edward. Too weak to lead an army himself, Edward delegated command to his trusted generals, including Aymer de Valence, the 2nd Earl of Pembroke, and Henry Percy, the 1st Baron Percy. The English response was swift. On June 19, 1306, Bruce suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Methven, forcing him into hiding. English forces systematically recaptured territories and executed Bruce's allies, reinforcing Edward's iron grip over Scotland. Brutal reprisals and the turning tide. Edward's suppression of Bruce's rebellion was marked by extreme brutality. Bruce's family and supporters faced gruesome fates. His sister, Mary, was imprisoned in a cage at Roxburgh Castle for 4 years, while Isabella Macduff, Countess of Buchan, who had played a crucial role in Bruce's coronation, was similarly held at Berwick Castle. Bruce's younger brother, Neil, was captured and executed through hanging, drawing, and quartering, a particularly gruesome punishment. Edward no longer regarded the conflict as a war between nations but as a rebellion requiring ruthless suppression. However, rather than crushing the Scottish resistance, these brutal reprisals strengthened Bruce's support. Many Scots who had been reluctant to oppose Edward now rallied behind Bruce. Using guerrilla tactics, Bruce evaded capture and began reclaiming key territories. His growing reputation as a leader committed to Scottish independence galvanized further resistance. Thanks for listening. Like, comment, and subscribe to Medieval Chronicles 1066 for more journeys back to the Middle Ages. Stay curious.